Hey, this is David Thompson, and I'm going to be going through the last phase of the game, the Soviet counter phase, in this, which is the fourth video in this overview series for how to play Pavlov's House. So this phase, the third phase of each turn, the Soviet counter phase, is where the actual defense of Pavlov's House occurs at the tactical level. So I've set up a sample, what a sample round status might look like, and I'm just going to go through all the different counters, the different types of counters, and show the different options they have for actions. So before we get started with the moves and the actual actions themselves, I want to just focus on a couple of counters specifically. So I'm going to show the leader counters. So the counters that have the C designation, which stands for command, there are three of them, and I've put them all in play here. When you start your turn, and all three of the counters, and there's only three of them in the game that have this attribute, the command attribute. When all three of them are in the house, and they can't be in the reserves, they actually have to be in combat positions at the beginning of your turn, you're going to get to move 4 counters and take 4 actions. Normally, you would just be able to move 3 times and take 3 actions. So it's a huge benefit to have all 3 of those counters in play. Now, you start with Pavlov. The other 2 counters are very expensive. So it's sometimes you may be enticed not to get them, but having that 4th action every turn can prove to be very powerful. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to cover. Next, we're just going to go through all the different basic actions. So every counter has a cost, unless they're one of the 4 counters that start in that building. They have their attack value, their suppression value, and then attributes or special actions they can take. So that's what a counter looks like. So let's talk about attacking. So that's the first number in the upper left there. So if a counter wants to attack, we have this color-coded indication here on this wall, which is the purple color. And you can see the corner space actually has two colors. So most of these are all purple. That means that these counters have line of sight to this avenue of approach for the Wehrmacht advance. So any of these counters could target anything in purple. So if I wanted to attack with this counter, I would take 1 dice, because he has an attack attribute of 1, roll it, and I'm going to compare the result to the defense of the Wehrmacht counter. So in this case, the defense is 4. I would need to roll 4 or higher to be successful. Now, once I've taken an action, the counter becomes exhausted, and I put this action token on the counter to designate that I've used one of my 4 actions this turn. So that's how an attack action would play out. Now, the other is 0 is suppress, so we cannot suppress. So we're going to move on to, well, actually, let's keep this simple. Let's just say I wanted to suppress with somebody who could. It would exhaust the token, and we would just put a suppression marker from the supplies in the house into the suppression area that matches the color. So we'll talk a little bit later on about why you would want to suppress, what's the advantage of that. But that is the suppression action. It's just placing a token from the supply into the color, the matching color. Okay, so now, in general, counters, there can only be 1 counter per combat location, combat position. But crew-served weapons are an exception to that. So if you have a machine gun or a mortar or a anti-tank rifle, it requires that you actually have 2 counters. You can't have just one use it. So in this case, we have 2 counters that have no inherent ability to attack or suppress, but they both have the G, which is the machine gun attribute. We also have the machine gun itself, which has the same attribute, which means now 2 counters could take an action each to use the machine gun to either attack with 2 or suppress with 3. So if we use it to suppress, we would just take 3 counters and put them in the suppression location, or if we'd use it to attack, we could attack any infantry. So I want to stress this. Infantry can only attack infantry, and unless they have an anti-tank rifle. So here we have an anti-tank rifle. You can see that the value is color-coded red, and that means that you can attack armor with the anti-tank rifle. Okay, so let's just say we did an attack. We would roll 2 dice. We're attacking the same guy, for example. We need a 4 to hit him, and we roll a couple, and we get it. So we only need 1 for a success. We got 2. So he is simply removed from the board. So, but for now, for later purposes, for examples, we're going to just leave him there. So that would be a couple of actions. So in that case, we would put 2 action markers there. Okay, Pavlov. So I've already talked about attacking, suppressing. I mentioned earlier the command attribute. If you have all 3 leaders in the building, allows you to get an extra action. The command attribute also has another function. So once a counter is flipped over into a suppressed side, that counter cannot take another action until it recovers, meaning it's flipped back. And you can't flip a counter over in the same turn that it took an action. So I can't take an action with them and then flip them back over and take another action. And that's why you mark them, just to help you remember that you took an action with them. But let's say they had taken actions in previous turns. We could take an action to flip him over. That would be one of our 4 actions. He could take an action to flip him over, so that would be 2. That gets very expensive from an action economy perspective. These leaders with the command attribute have a very powerful ability to command other counters to recover. And that includes counters that have been disrupted. So we're just going to grab a disruption token, and I'll explain how counters can become disrupted. But let's just say, for right now, he's disrupted, and these 2 are exhausted. We can use Pavlov's action, so we're going to give him an action token, to recover 3 things. And that can be any combination of recovering from exhaustion and removing disruption. So we take 1 action with him to essentially take 3 actions. Okay, so that's the command. Now we have a forward observer. So he has 1 attack, 0 suppress, and a forward observer ability. So what does that do? Well, first of all, to use it, you have to have an artillery token in place. So we don't right now, but let's say we did. Let's say we had this token here in place. We could use his action. So that would be action. We place the token on him. And now we can call in an artillery strike. So it's going to spin the token. The token is discarded. And we're going to go here, and he can call in an artillery strike to any avenue of approach you can see. So it has to be purple. He can attack 2 adjacent counters, and it doesn't matter if they're armor or infantry. So it's very powerful from the flexibility perspective. He's going to roll 2 dice against each of the 2 targets. So let's just say he targets the rifleman and the Panzer IV. So we'll target the rifleman first. So he's successful because the rifleman has a defense of 4, so it would be removed. And then we're going to target the Panzer IV. We need a 6 or higher to win, or to beat it, which we do not get. So that's how the forward observer works. So it costs an action, and it depletes an artillery token, but it's a very powerful, very flexible ability. And so we're going to keep him there for later. Okay, so the anti-tank rifle. I alluded to this earlier. Again, it's a crew-served weapon. We have a couple of guys here with the anti-tank rifle ability, so they can use it. Now, let's focus on this counter for just a second. He also has another attribute, the I, and that stands for Inspire. And that's for, there's 1 anti-tank rifleman that has that ability, and there's 1 machine gunner that has the ability. And they're the leaders of the units, the anti-tank rifle units and machine gun units that were operating in the house at the time. So if those units are on the board, anywhere on the board, in a combat position, not in the reserves, if they're on the board, any anti-tank rifle attack would get an extra dice, even if it's not part of the group with the weapon. It just has to be in the building somewhere. So the actual value here would be 4 dice instead of 3 dice to roll. So let's say we're going to attack the Panzer IV. And the other thing I should point out is this position is both red and purple. So they actually have the ability to target anyone in red or purple. Of course, that means they are also targetable by anybody in red or purple. So we're going to roll our 4 dice. We're hoping for a 6 or higher. We get it. So we would remove the Panzer IV, but that would take 2 actions. So, okay. And we would just put the tokens there, obviously. So we've already talked about this token doesn't bring anything new except for the S, the Storm Group Assault, and we'll talk about that in a later video. This token just has attack and suppress, nothing special there. Now we look at our sniper. Now he doesn't have anything special, all he does is attack. We've talked about attacking before, but attacking with a 4 dice is extremely powerful, and that's why this is the most expensive counter in the game. So very powerful, almost a certainty that he will always be successful when he attacks. We've already talked about machine gunner. This is just an example of a more effective machine gun. Still takes the team there. And then this position. Now, this counter has no special abilities we haven't already covered, but the position being in the radio is important. So what that means is any counter in this position that's not exhausted can take an action, so we place the action token there, and then we gain 2 points to go into any of the counters and recruit 2 new points worth. So let's say, for example, we wanted these 2 counters. They cost 1 point each, so with 2 points we could easily just take them and drop them in the reserves. Okay, one thing I completely forgot to talk about is before all those actions, I just launched into the actions. At the beginning of the turn, before you take the actions, is when you move. So we should have been able to move around, so I'm just going to walk through what that looks like. It's pretty simple. You have 4 movement. We could just move units around, so we can move a couple of guys from the reserves. That's easy. You could also take a counter, and as long as the counter is not exhausted or doesn't have a disrupted token on it, you can take a counter, move it into that position, and move that counter that was there either to the reserves or to another empty position. You can't chain this, so you couldn't say move him here, and then move him here. You can't do that. You can only push him one space. So at the beginning of the turn, we would have gotten 4 movement to use in a similar way. Like I said, you can't move into a position if a counter is exhausted or disrupted. Okay, so I think that covers everything. I'm pretty sure I covered all of the basics for the different actions there. There's some things that happen here in the supplies with tokens that I didn't cover in detail, but we're going to cover those odds and ends in the final video. So thanks for watching.